So we have some important news in the current efforts to remove suppressors and short-barreled rifles from the NFA nationwide. The Trump DOJ continues to argue that the NFA's restrictions are valid despite the new $0 tax on those items. But now members of Congress have joined together to push back and remove the remaining restrictions, and they're calling out Pam Bondi and the Trump DOJ. So let's talk about what is happening in this critical case. Now, before we jump into this video, if you guys want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe. Also, double check to make sure YouTube is not unsubscribed you. And then also, if you want to further support the channel, check out the podcast link down below in the detail section. Also in the pinned comment, if you want to get the audio only version of these videos, you can check that out using those podcast links. So as I mentioned in the intro, we need to talk about what is happening right now in response to the Big Beautiful Bill and the recent $0 tax NFA change that happened through that law. Now, if you've been following the channel for a while, you will know that HR 1 passed, and in that, we got the reduction of the NFA tax. It took it from $200 per stamp all the way to $0, which will start next year. But in response to that, multiple toy organizations have moved to finish the job and remove the remaining NFA restrictions. You have lawsuits like the one from GOA, FRAC, Silencer Shop, Palmetto State Armory, Silencer Co. They filed a lawsuit against the ATF. And in that lawsuit, you also have 15 states who joined on in support of striking down the remaining NFA restrictions. This coalition of toy organizations and states have moved to end that lawsuit sooner rather than later. They want to get rid of the NFA immediately, and they are trying to do that with a motion for summary judgment. Now, recently, the DOJ responded in that case, and in that case, they continue to argue that the NFA's restrictions are still valid despite the new $0 tax on those items. This is not really surprising since Pam Bondi and the DOJ have now established kind of a firm track record of defending the NFA. But in response to this, now members of Congress have joined together and have sent a letter to Pam Bondi and the DOJ pushing back against her current defense of the NFA. 5 senators and 36 members of the House have joined together in this letter to tell Pam Bondi to change her position, that the DOJ needs to get, with the 2A effort, they need to back this 2A cause and stop defending the NFA in these cases. Now, in this lawsuit filed by GOA and these other groups, they argue that since there is no longer a tax on these items like suppressors, SBRs, SBSs, and AOWs, there is no longer a valid constitutional basis to further regulate them under the NFA. Now, in summary, what GOA and the other plaintiffs asked for in this case is for the court to declare that the NFA's registration and transfer requirements pertaining to these now untaxed items goes beyond Congress's enumerated powers. In this case, the plaintiffs filed a motion for summary judgment to end the case sooner rather than later. And what that means is that both sides are seeking to end this dispute and this case before going to a full trial. However, the ATF and the Trump DOJ continue to defend the NFA. In their new brief, the Trump DOJ makes multiple arguments for why the NFA should still remain valid, should still be on the books despite that NFA tax change. Now, when it comes to the taxing power question raised in this case, the Trump DOJ argues that even though the One Big Beautiful Act here recently reduced the making and transfer taxes on these items, they argue that the statute still is valid because it imposes what they say is a special occupational tax on manufacturers, dealers, and importers. Now, because the challenge requirements support the enforcement and collection of that remaining tax on the industry, the Trump DOJ claims that the restrictions on those items themselves still falls within Congress's taxing powers. The brief explicitly states that the registration and approval system forms a web of regulation assisting tax enforcement, and therefore it's still valid. The DOJ then walks out the Commerce Clause as a basis to also still uphold the NFA. The DOJ argues the NFA regulates the interstate market for short-barreled rifles and shotguns, suppressors, and AOWs, and the brief notes that most NFA firearms are manufactured and sold through interstate commerce, and the NFA's requirements attach to all stages of that commerce: the manufacture, distribution, sale by dealers, and purchase by the individuals. So that's all to say that Pam Bondi and the Trump DOJ are opposing the NFA challenge with multiple arguments. They claim that it still does align with Congress's taxing powers, that it is consistent with the Commerce Clause, and also that it does not violate the Second Amendment. But as I mentioned, multiple members of Congress have now stepped up on this issue. They recently sent a letter to Pam Bondi telling her that the administration needs to change course on this issue. In the letter, they state that, "We write to inform the DOJ of Congress's position and intent regarding ongoing litigation challenging the NFA registration and transfer requirements for now non-tax NFA firearms following the enactment of President Trump's landmark Second Amendment victory in the Big Beautiful Bill. In enacting this bill into law, Congress affirmed its position that the taxation and registration provisions of the NFA are inseparably linked, and it expressed its intent to repeal the NFA's registration and transfer requirements by eliminating the associated taxes on certain firearms and silencers. In light of the DOJ's recent filing opposing this interpretation, we must express our serious concern and disappointment that the DOJ has chosen to advance a theory that not only conflicts with Congress's express intent, but also disregards the constitutional structure upon which the NFA has rested since 1934. Therefore, we again urge the DOJ to adopt and advance Congress's stated position in all litigation concerning these provisions, to ensure that congressional intent is accurately represented and upheld before the courts. In the letter, they then later go on to point out that, in Congress's view, the registration requirement under the NFA are in fact inseparably linked to the taxation provisions. This is important because that is exactly the opposite from what Pam Bondi and the DOJ continue to argue in all of these NFA challenges, including this GOA silencer shop case that is currently in a district court in Texas. Congress goes on to point out in the letter that the department's recent filing disregards this reality and advances a theory that would effectively transform the NFA from a tax statute into an independent federal gun registration regime, an outcome Congress has never authorized, has repeatedly rejected, and in fact expressly prohibited with the Firearms Owners Protection Act. They state that the department is fully empowered to decline to defend statutory provisions that no longer rest on a valid constitutional basis. It has exercised that authority before, and they point with the fact that they did that with Obamacare, and it must do so again here, this time in defense of Americans' Second Amendment rights. So this is good news, and again, you have members of Congress jumping in support of these NFA cases. They're saying that the intent of Congress with reducing the tax was to also eliminate down the road the rest of the registration and transfer requirements. They say that the DOJ has the power to not enforce this. They've done it before in other situations when, reduction of these items has happened, in Obamacare. So they say that the DOJ here needs to get on board, defend the Second Amendment, and do the same thing here in this case. These members of Congress who passed the $0 tax are telling them that was not their intent and that the DOJ needs to realign their arguments and defend the Second Amendment in these challenges. So that's what's currently going on in the critical NFA challenge that was trying to build off of the $0 tax that was passed in the Big Beautiful Bill. The Trump DOJ has, argued against that. Pam Bondi has argued against that in these NFA cases, but now you have members of Congress sending her a letter saying, you are wrong, you need to change your position, this is not what we intended, and you're not pro 2A if you continue down this road. So that's what's currently going on. As we get more information, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, you can check out one of the videos here on the screen that the algorithm thinks that you'll find helpful. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.